Hello there, a wonderful evening from Austria, Virtual Space Hero community. Welcome again to our Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live here, but we're also streaming to Facebook and YouTube. So to all of you out there joining from the different platforms, I'm happy to welcome you to our discussion today. And we had a lot of comments and also questions already beforehand. So I'm trying to pack that all into those 42 minutes. And those of you who attended also and participated in our live discussion last week, you might have a similar feeling than I do. And that is, we feel pretty fit. Why fit? Because we went with Melanie Martinelli from the Learning Gym. We looked at mitigating designer bias, Learning Gym style, right? So fit and exercise number one. Last week, we had Shilpa here on our LinkedIn live stage, and we continued the conversation talking about inclusive virtual design or inclusive virtual facilitation. And today we continue with our exercise, not connecting from the Learning Gym, but a very proud cooperation partner of the Learning Gym. I'm welcoming on the Virtual Space Hero stage here, Matthew Richter, connecting from the Tiagi Group and the US coast there. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, Barbara. Thanks for having me back.
Fantastic. It's so great to have you back. Have you heard? So today we're going to do some more exercise, Learning Gym style exercise, correct?
Yeah, Melanie's been trying to get me to exercise for years, but as you can see, I just don't do that. So
that is totally fine. Today we're going
trying to get me to run.
Fantastic. And I know that last time, I remember Almendra already mentioned the green monkey, the yellow elephant. We already debriefed that. Those of you who are now a little bit lost, you gotta watch our LinkedIn Live from December. It was really fantastic, and we were talking about this JOLT activity. But today we're talking about the biggest learning misconceptions. And it's really a fantastic topic, Matthew. Maybe you want to give some sort of intro. Why should we talk about that?
Well, there are so many things that we do in our field that are pervasive, that we've either grown up doing, that are ingrained in the education we had decades ago, or for those of you as old as me, decades ago, or they're things that we see on LinkedIn and they look good, but many of them don't have, or they lack scientific rigor. And so there are so many things that we use and we either charge money or spend money on, and we spend a ton of money on, and they don't work, or we're using them inappropriately. And our friend Clark Quinn distinguishes between myths, learning myths, things that we just made up and we use even though we know they don't exist, in contrast to misconceptions, things that may work, but we've just through doing them over and over again, we use them inappropriately. And I really like that distinction. So we really need to be cautious of this, because A, if we use something and it doesn't work, that's not so good. And B, if we do something and it doesn't work and we spend a lot of money, that's not so good either. So these are some of the concerns. We definitely need to also pay attention to the notion of, but it feels like it works. And that's an internal bias that we need to combat, because we can fool ourselves pretty easily.
Mm-hmm. And I think we talked about that also the last time when we debriefed our discussion here on LinkedIn, like that I was in research for like 10 years, so almost a decade I was a researcher. Yeah. And one of my sort of passion topics is definitely empirical human or evidence-based human resource management. So right. That means also in human resource management practices, very often we just do something without even considering the foundation that we would have if we'd look into research and evidence-based content. And therefore, I'm super happy to have you here. And I'm really looking forward, because Clark Quinn, for those of you out there who know him and you want to read into it, we have it here, Myths versus Misconceptions. Clark Quinn is going to be also on my LinkedIn Live in March here. So big shout out to look at that, look that up. Matthew, so it is clear that we need to look into misconceptions and misleading interpretations maybe. So what would you think is the biggest misunderstanding when we talk about learning, or the biggest 3 misunderstandings when we talk about learning?
Well, some of the myths that are out there, learning styles. So I don't know how many people are on with us now, but there's a huge misconception that if we adapt to a learner's learning style or learning preference, that we can enhance the learning outcome. That if we design learning around their preferences, learning will improve. This has been debunked over and over and over again. Decades now of research is highlighting the fact that this doesn't work. I actually have a link of research that if people want, so that I list out. So, but I don't see how I can add a chat, something into the chat.
We're going to add that later. After
Okay,
the conversation, we go to LinkedIn. We're going to add that for you. Absolutely.
There. Then I'll put them there. But learning styles is a big one, and we still see it. And even though the research is out there, you'll see on LinkedIn someone talking about learning styles this or learning styles that. So it's pervasive. Another big one, I don't know how many of you out there are using MBTI, Myers-Briggs. This is a personality assessment, and this has been fully diminished in the field, and we have tons of problematic evidence to show that MBTI just not only doesn't work, but can lead people to really big misunderstandings about themselves and the people around them. And there's great references around that. Or, Paul Kirshner has written a wonderful book called Urban Myths, and he has a great chapter deconstructing Myers-Briggs, among many other things. Those are 2 things. Many people, I just saw again a learning pyramid or Dale's cone going around LinkedIn, and this is another highly problematic myth that's been pervasive. The learning pyramid suggests that there are different ways in which you learn more effectively. Someone, not the original guy who created it, but someone later put percentages on, which were all ended in 0. And those percentages have somehow found their way into it. And so these are 3 examples of things that get used. DISC is another one. I know I used to be a reseller of DISC. I was wholly into DISC. I thought it was the coolest thing since sliced bread. And I love sliced bread. But DISC has got many of the same problems Myers-Briggs have. The key is that all of these things are often vendor driven. And so if you think about it, so many people are making a lot of money on these tools, and we succumb to some of the marketing of them. So coming out now you'll see a lot of things saying neuroscience, or neuroscience says, or we're neuroscience based. And this is
wait. And I found the term neuromyths in a research article lately.
Yes. In fact, hey, can I give you a test?
Ooh, go ahead.
All right. True or false? Does the brain only use about 10% of its capacity? True or false?
I would say true.
True or false? By the way, it's false. True or false? New learners indeed learn better when their preferences are met. I just talked about this one. So this one.
Yeah, but I thought so. Even I thought so. Because in my trainer education, they taught us this.
Of course they did. Of course they did. All right. How about this one? Does playing Mozart make babies learn better? If you play Mozart while babies are doing activities, do they learn better?
That's what they told me.
No, false. What about doing puzzles? Puzzles will make your brain stronger. Have you, like me, ever bought one of those apps that enable you to strengthen your brain through puzzles? True or false?
I have something similar, yes.
Yeah, false. True. False. Yeah, they're all false. Here's one more. Are right brain people more creative than left brain people?
Yes, because the left ones are more logical, aren't they?
Actually, totally false. These are great examples of myths that have become pervasive throughout our industry. Now think about it. These are neuromyths. These all fall under the neuromythology category, right? If you think about it, every one of these things are inbred into our way of thinking. We design training around some of these concepts and ideas. And when we do, we continue to perpetuate these myths as we push them out. So you said you learn this in school, in a university setting, you're learning these things. That's horrifying when you think about it.
It is. It is.
But what about other things? What about emotional intelligence? The new fancy, everyone loves emotional intelligence, EQ or EI, depending on your idea. What do you think?
Well, I have not been reading that much into EQ, but I am a huge, I was as a researcher, we were using CQ, cultural intelligence.
Oh my gosh, don't get me started on these new ones.
Oh la la.
All right, but there's a ton of criticism of EQ out there, and most of us are out buying tools, buying card games, putting it into our programs. Now, I do not want anyone to walk away saying I'm saying emotions don't exist. They obviously do. I am not out there claiming that we shouldn't adapt and modify our behavior based on how we feel or how others feel. We absolutely should be sensitive. But EQ is an idea or a model that's come out of several thinkers, one of them being Daniel Goleman, but other folks had the idea as well. And we need to consider that there are problems inherent with the way these guys structured the concept. And it's that we should be critical of and attack. And I don't mean attack in a mean way. I mean attack intellectually. We should develop the skill, the value to challenge ideas, to try and make sure that an idea actually is valid and reliable before we start applying it in a way that might be irresponsible. Would you like your doctor to use something that might be an old wives' tale?
Wow. Well, of course not. What kind of question?
Well, then why do we want our trainers doing that?
But you know what? I'm just thinking, as Rigoberto is saying, shock about all those misconceptions. Me too, as well. And Tomas is also saying, got all the answers wrong. Totally. And the point is, I also have to say, as a researcher, so I was reading a lot of academic papers. We do know that they are quite complicated and complex. They are, and very often they're even written in a complicated way. So to critically analyze them, you almost need to have a researcher education to some extent, because
you
the
don't.
reading, you don't. Go ahead.
How about this? What if we give you some steps for how to think through these ideas? So how about this? Step one, where did I get this idea? If you can ask yourself, all right, I'm going to utilize emotional intelligence or multiple intelligence, which has a whole different set of problems. Or I want to use DISC or MBTI, or we're going to employ learning styles in our design. Start with number one, where did I get the idea? That's a very important thing, because the source of it, you have to determine whether that source was trustworthy. In other words, is that source, number two, reliable? The third thing, actually, number three, is there research then to validate that idea? You don't have to sift through the research or read it. Just find out, is there stuff out there that actually says, yeah, we've done studies on it? Because if the answer is no, you can stop right now. If the answer is yes, then does it make sense? Does that research make sense? And can I explain why I agree and whether my reasons are evidence-based?
But Matthew, there is a lot of research about EQ and CQ, and they are criticizing studies back and forth as authors are criticizing each other. So I'm just saying that, following up on the whole academic discussion and criticism on certain research design, because the point is that, okay, I can identify the researcher or the author, like Daniel Goleman, he's heavily cited. So one indicator of somebody reliable could be a good
What's
citation.
Well, yeah, and this is where it's insidious, right? Because if a person writes a book, books are never peer reviewed, they're not peer evaluated. And so we have to be really careful if the research is coming from a book. It doesn't mean it's bad. We just have to evaluate it. If it's peer reviewed, now we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, what did the peers say? Well, it was good enough to get into the journal, but has the study been done more than once? In other words, is it replicated? For it to be replicated, the study must be able to be replicated. In other words, as a researcher, I need to be able to do the same scenarios, same setup. I need to have the same types of controls. So a study that can be replicated, was it replicated? Then what happened? What were the results to that? And it's not a bad thing in science for people to disagree. This is a wonderful thing. This is how we learn.
That's what's it about, yeah.
We have to be super careful not to conflate disagreement in a discourse in science as the same as disagreement on Facebook. It's not the same kind of argument, right? Scientists work within parameters, and their disagreements might be here to here often, right? Where if we get into politics on Facebook, that's a whole different ballgame. But in science, the disagreements are nuanced. My friend Miriam Nealon loves that word, nuance. And it's such an important word when we're thinking about science and evidence-based things. We have to explore that. But if you're not trained in that, that's okay. If you can just start with the questions I just shared, that goes a long way to weed out a lot of the garbage. Here's one other thing I would urge you to consider. Is the study done by the vendor? So if you look at a lot of the stuff around emotional intelligence, the same people doing those studies are the same people selling tools. Not that their study is wrong, but you have to question some of the objectivity of it. And if there aren't too many researchers who are objective doing studies, that tells you a lot as well. And so emotional intelligence, I'm not saying it's a bad model. I'm saying we need to do more. Emotional intelligence is one of those misconceptions. It's one of those things we need to study more and have better research on before we continue to spend the millions and millions and millions that get spent on it. There isn't enough research to validate the concept. I hope that makes sense.
Well, there is already a comment exactly what you were mentioning now, emotional intelligence. So Eric is asking, there are many studies out there proving that emotional intelligence is relevant. Matthew, can you prove that it is not? And then he's mentioning, Eric, thanks a lot also for the source here. There's a study on EI with 75,000 from all over the world, and it says EI is a huge impact on personal success at workplace.
So this is great. First of all, these are where my questions come in, right? So first, who did the study? Second, where was the study published? Thirdly, how was the study designed? In other words, if the study is self-reported, self-reporting experiments and studies are wholly problematic because self-reporting is an issue in of itself. And a quick look on Google Scholar on the merits of self-reported surveys, you can find a ton of things. I don't know if this study was done that way, but I'm betting it is, because the majority of emotional intelligence tools out there, other than one, I think the EC2 is not self-reported. I can't remember. But most of these tools are self-reported, which means there are inherent flaws in how we can gather data and determine what's out there. So is this study good? Well, I'd have to look at it. But just because someone says there's a study, and I'm not referring to Eric, I'm referring to the person who wrote it, we need to go and ask a few more deeper questions. So, where is it? Who wrote it? Is this person qualified to have written it? Is this peer reviewed? How is the study constructed? What were the controls? One of the big issues with emotional intelligence is a lot of the things we teach in outside of the model yield similar effects. And so it's hard to separate the factors in emotional intelligence from the other things that are there. Again, I don't know this study, but these are the questions I would start with to determine whether what I'm saying is bulldookie. There are, by the way, tons of references, which, Barbara, if I don't do it, remind me. I will link into the LinkedIn thing later. But I think before our session, my friend Blair Kettle brought up the issue of emotional intelligence, and I laid out in the LinkedIn post several of the issues with EI, and that might also be an interesting place for you to look, Eric. I also put all the references that identify a lot of the problems, as well as the problems with some of the studies that I think this one you're referring to might fall into.
Fantastic. I think I totally agree that we always need to, and Eric, that's true. Maybe you can also post a link to the study that you're mentioning on whatever platform it is. Just post it into the chat, and then we can later on check it. We can't do that now live, but we definitely can do so later. And I'd be also super interested because, as I said, you're right, Matthew, that there are many ways on how we can sort of question the article or the study or the results people are or the authors are mentioning. But still, I need to, I have to say that it is a complex thing, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing that, but I'm just saying that we are overreading easily sometimes, even if there is a complex mathematical model, for example, behind the study. I wouldn't be able to understand it because I was then rather a qualitative researcher.
Well, and here, let me ask you this other question then. And no, not a test. But when one of the things, I don't know about you, but there are things, models and stuff that I've learned that if you attack them, my first reaction is, what are you talking about? Of course that's valid. Of course that's reliable. I've known about that all my life. I see it happening. I observe it working. Well, I'm proven wrong every day when I have those emotional reactions because we ourselves are not the most reliable observers. Will Thalheimer has done quite a bit recently on learners are often the worst judges of their own effectiveness. I think Kirshner has done some of that as well. And the same is true when we start to evaluate what we like and what we work. Our own observations of what we see in everyday life don't always come through as reliable. And that's very important because if we rely on that to determine why we should like something, we're going to ultimately be wrong more often than not. But definitely we'll have an emotional attachment to certain things. And I do the same thing. We all do. So do you get angry when someone attacks your model?
It's also what you were saying is a little bit what we were discussing with Melanie about the confirmation bias, right? That we see or we see what we want to see because that's what we learned and that's what we see in our trainings, or that's what we want to see is happening when we apply a tool. Fantastic. So we talked about why do we need to think better or analyze better as trainers as well? What are the learning misconceptions out there? The learning myth, we talked about them. And I remember also in our last discussion, and I think it was Charles-Louis the Mayor who was talking about it's all about communication styles. So what would you say here? So there are no learning styles, there are no processing styles. It's all about communication styles.
Well, I don't even know. So first of all, I love Charles-Louis. I think of him as my younger brother that I wish I had, but I have no idea what he's talking about. So when
maybe he didn't say that. Wait. And I'm putting out a quote here. Wait, Charles-Louis? I think that's what you said.
Is he in the thing?
Let's see. Charles-Louis? No, I don't know.
But I think what he's talking about is we have different ways in which we interact with people, and we have preferences for that. And if I say something to you that's going to hurt your feelings or attacks you, you'll have a reaction. And that certainly can affect my willingness to open up and learn, or I can shut down motivationally if you insult me, right? For example, if I stand here and I tell you emotional intelligence is crap, it's the worst thing since sliced bread, and so forth, blah, 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 and you are someone who's selling it and working hard with it, that can be offensive. And I'm not going to have a lot of positive effect, trying to convince you I'm right. Probably you're not going to either, convincing me you're right. And we have a stylistic difference that's escalating, right? We do know that it's a myth that you can't debunk people who are passionate about their thing. There's been a lot of research recently. There's a new study that's just come out that if you remind me later, I'll be happy to give you the link, that says, no, actually, we can talk to people who believe fallacious things and get them to see the more accurate side. For example, anti-vaccination. People who don't believe there should be vaccinations. Well, you can actually sit down with them and have a conversation and work through it. And there's a whole process that's been studied on having those kinds of conversations. So I'm not totally sure what Charles-Louis was talking about, but I'm guessing it might have to do something with that.
Perfect. But anyways, I'm going to follow up with him. Charles-Louis, you expect a message in inbox from me.
Yeah, you're getting a phone call, Charles-Louis.
Totally. So we started talking about a little bit the different misconceptions, the myths that we see, and that it's also our responsibility. But clearly we all know as well that it's quite difficult to get out of this vicious cycle of misconceptions, because clients who don't know, they want you to use those tools. So there needs to be a lot of sort of background knowledge on our side to really sort of tell the client why it's not necessary to use that tool, but rather do something differently. But let's go now, and that's what I want to focus on a little bit in the last 15 minutes now. What are then not learning myths? So what are things that work?
Okay. Well, we have to be careful because it's not an opposite, right? So things we know that don't work don't necessarily have an opposite thing that will work. So we have to be very careful of that. So the idea is things work within the parameters for how they work. So if you're going to use a tool like the Big Five or Hexago, this is a personality tool. This has about 45 years of research, maybe more, that actually has shown that it's pretty reliable. So for example, if you're looking for a replacement for MBTI, Hexago or the Big Five, free, by the way, you can get it for free, but it does have a research rigor behind it. But now you have to look at how am I applying that? So there's a difference between, okay, do we have a tool that has some rigor behind it? Yes. But now how I apply it has to be evaluated as well, right? So it's more complex than the opposite side of it. So I always like to say, well, what's your objective? So what is your objective of using learning styles? Well, many people will say, my objective is to ensure that every person in our workshop has access to the content, access to the skill development, the ability to practice, and so forth. That's great. I totally agree with that objective. That isn't my objective too, right? Well, what we do know is that if you design learning toward the objective, in other words, if my objective is for people to learn how to practice having a difficult conversation, well, first, you have to give them some structure, some knowledge around that. You have to do some direct instruction. Secondly, you need to give them some scenarios and context that people can put in place. Thirdly, you need to give them a chance to practice and do it and get feedback. Fourthly, you need to make sure that there's corrective action for things they either didn't understand or misapplied, and so on. So we need to design the learning for the objective, not the participant's style. And so not quite an opposite, but there's a methodology that we know works.
And would you say that it's always those 3 steps, and that's research proven? Empirical data proves that if I use the 3 steps that you were mentioning, learning occurs in a better way.
Well, again, there are other contextual factors that can undermine learning. And I would refer you to Paul Kirshner again. I know I'm his biggest fanboy right now, but he has a wonderful book with Miriam Nealon on evidence-based learning design. This is a phenomenal book, and they talk about those steps, but also several other factors that enhance learning. Also, on one of our websites, the Learning Development Accelerator, before the paywall, so this is free, there's a section in their stuff called The Giants in L&D, and Paul is interviewed. And in that interview, Paul talks about the factors that are needed for people to learn. And so a lot of what I'm talking about comes from Paul. So you can find that on our website. So you got to remember,
and here you go with the website. Give me a sec. So everybody's wondering, what's the website? Here it is, right?
LDaccelerator.com. Go to stuff, go to Giants of Learning, click on Paul Kirshner.
That's where you need to go. LDaccelerator.com. .com, of course.
The com is very important. As Charlie said, com is important. That joke died. That's a horrible joke. Sorry. So you got to be careful, right? Context is so important, and context is very important to learning. So if you take those steps and you try and teach someone out of context, their learning is diminished. And so there's so many factors. Learning is messy. It's complex. And too often we want a simple way to get people to do things. And that's one of the reasons a lot of these myths and misconceptions occur, because we're looking for the easy way.
We're looking for the easy way, and also the way that we believe is the way that we should structure it, because we have been taught so. And maybe it's also a little bit the critical thinking, the critical mind behind how we question what we are being taught. But again, Matthew, I don't want to be annoying, but I insist that having been a researcher for 10 years, I do know that reading through the studies is still a hard and a tough job.
Can I make a suggestion?
So, go ahead.
So there are people out there, not me, but there are people out there who do learning research translation. I call them the learning translators or the research translators. I've already mentioned Paul Kirshner. There's Will Thalheimer, who's my partner with LDA. He works with me and Tiagi on the LDA. Miriam Nealon, who works quite a bit with Paul. Julie Dirksen, who's independent from us. Clark Quinn. Carl Kapp, who's a game design guy. He's a wonderful professor who's doing a lot of great work around the science around games. Jane Bozarth, who's an incredible person who's put out a tremendous number of studies, many of which are aligned with what I've been saying. She's the head of content and research for the Learning Guild. Patty Schenk, Ruth Clark, whom I think is one of the founding thought leaders in our field, and there are a ton more. I'm forgetting people, but these folks, they work on reading the research and they're trained in that, and then they write summaries of it. Now, should you trust them? I fight with Thalheimer all the time, but if Thalheimer says the same thing as Julie, who says the same thing as Patty, these are usually 3 independent interpretations. So I always look for 3 interpretations of it. And if I can get that, then I feel pretty confident moving forward. So just my thought.
You're totally right. I think that's a very important point that you're mentioning, also to look into people who are translating the research and who are trained in understanding it properly. Also, one other thing that sometimes we are looking at researchers ourselves, we are looking at meta studies. So studies that look at 100, 200 studies in the field of EQ and analyzes all of them to see a trend and to look into validity and reliability of the whole field in this case, for example. So I think these are also aspects that we definitely can take into consideration. But all the names that you mentioned, I'm pretty sure that people can find them very likely on the LDaccelerator.com webpage, or if they follow you, correct?
They can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm referencing these folks all the time. They are my gurus. And,
absolutely.
And Tiagi introduced me to most of them and 20, 25 years ago. These are giants in the industry. Guy Wallace, I left off Guy, but these are giants in our field who have done a lot of the legwork, so we don't have to, recreate the wheel.
Absolutely. But there is something else coming up. So if we talk about learning, and if we talk about developing also our interactive techniques. We do know that there is the 23rd to the 25th of March, there's a tremendous conference coming up, right?
We call it ITIL for short. And you can join us. We are going to actually talk about several of these issues that we were just raised, but we also have Melanie and Shilpa. Barbara will be there. We have Charlotte will be there. My friend Yves Willems will be there. Marion Ferland from France. So this is a conference on using interactive approaches to learning for improved learning outcomes. So what works, what doesn't work. We're going to spend a lot of time, because of the context, talking about live online learning and for obvious reasons. But a lot of what we do can be transferred back to in person if and when that happens. So that'll be where that's at. By the way, if you hear knocking on the door, that's my cat who wants in. So,
yeah, we hear her sort of grabbing, right?
That's the cat going.
Fantastic. We're almost at the end. The cat feels that the end is coming up soon here, right?
It is nigh. Winter's coming.
Yeah, dramatic. Fantastic. So, guys, ladies and gentlemen out there, we have the Interactive Techniques for Improved Learning Conference. I think it's really, if you look at the webpage, it's a tremendous program that is expecting you there. And as we now know as well, it is also a very research-driven conference. So we can be sure, but we need to question, of course, as well, whatever we hear all the time, but we can be sure that there is a lot of content that is also based on empirical data that we are being confronted with, or we are being presented there.
Hey, can I say one last thing?
Go ahead.
If you contact Barbara's and her team, she has a secret discount code.
Yay. Thanks so much. So if you want to, and if you're interested in a discount code, you need to, hopefully you are already, you need to become a virtual space hero. In our free Explorer membership area, you find under the section exclusive fantastic events, that's how we call it there, you find the ITIL conference plus our discount code. So definitely have a look there, and also check out, I just uploaded today our research report that we did last year with my students group working on the virtual learning experience of virtual learners in 2020. And that's really interesting results that the students came up with, plus a learner's toolkit that they developed. So that might be also of interest for you. But Matthew, so what is the most, what is your number one technique, if you have, or you can also mention your number three, your first three, top three, about learning transfer and making learning stick? Because now we know it's not about presenting content in a visual or auditive way, or people should read and do, the work is not working, right, left brain is not working, or there is no, at least no empirical data for that. So what do you like beyond thinking about the three steps that you mentioned before, the objectives?
There's more than three, but I'll give you three of them. And then the Garnick affect the rest. So learning needs to be contextualized. If people don't have a context, it's much more difficult for people to manage that. You need to provide, it's a fallacy to think that learners can learn just by doing stuff. You need to provide direct instruction, particularly with inexperienced people or people who don't know stuff. Otherwise, it's highly frustrating. So using structured sharing approaches to teach content that people don't know, not going to work. You need to provide direct instruction. And direct instruction doesn't have to be a lecture. There are many ways we can give direct instruction. You need people to have time to have spaced practice. In other words, they do it, they practice, they try again, they get some feedback, they think about it, reflect on it, and come back and do it again. So spacing out learning is much more effective. And those are just three.
And I really love the spacing concept, because I think this is also, for me, the beauty of the virtual space, because that's something that we can, of course, do in an in-presence setting, but very often companies, if we think about organizational context, we don't really have the structures nor the possibilities to plan it in such a spaced way, at least out of my experience. So also now, dear trainers and dear colleagues, we need to use the possibilities that we have now in the virtual space to really use these elements of input, practice, experience, reflection. Wait, Matthew, now there is one question. Dear God, what about Kolb's experiential learning cycle?
Paul Kirshner has a wonderful chapter in Urban Myths on this.
Oh, dear God.
I didn't say he called it a myth.
What did he call it?
Go look at the book. Go buy Paul's book. No, the issue with Kolb, again, is similar to some other things. It's more complex. And so we have to, so the cycle of learning, sure, we're good. Okay, fine. But there are more complexities to it as we look at contextualizing. The notion of having this space learning, for example, isn't necessarily represented there. And so there are more complexities to it. Is it a myth? No, but it's nuanced, right? To use Miriam Nealon's word again, there's nuance to it. And so we need to go deeper. It's not, we can't reduce everything to a 2x2 or to a 4-part model, right? There's complexity in life, and things like Kolb or Bloom's taxonomy, which is highly problematic. Yeah. Well, first of all, is it accurate? You have to ask yourself if it is Bloom's taxonomy accurate. Well, probably not. There isn't too much research to support its accuracy in either version. But does it help us to get better outcomes in learning? Maybe, but we're not totally sure because there isn't enough study on that aspect of it. And so we got to look at the complexity of things. It's never so simple an answer as, yes, it's great, yes, it's bad. It's more nuanced. And the more we adopt this notion of nuance is not such a bad thing, the better off we'll be.
And that's a good point, because that also gives us a huge field of research for us passionate researchers, right? Because we need to prove and prove over again, because we are being criticized because of our sampling, the control variables, because of some parts in the, or some aspects of the methods. And that's why research is also a super critical field to work in, because it's highly.
That's why I really love Clark's, and I'm going to show up for Clark's session because I love Clark. Clark, anyone who doesn't know Clark Quinn, go out and learn everything you can, for Clark is just one of the giants. I love this guy. And Clark's distinction, he also has a third one called superstitions, but his distinction between myths versus misconceptions is so important. Things like learning styles applied to learning design, myth. So this one, we can black and white say this is not good. Okay, but then there are things that are more nuanced, like 70-20-10. 70-20-10 is a big debate, right? We know that the numbers are foolish. In fact, Yasaritz and Charles Jennings, I don't know if they fully disavowed the numbers, but they've changed the name of their company and are talking more about the concepts versus the numbers now, because the numbers were highly problematic and the research doesn't replicate. So it's nuanced when we look at that. So it's probably more of a misconception in how we apply it rather than a necessarily bad idea. So things have to be better thought through when we go through it. But I would urge people to always ask, what evidence do you have if you think it works? Why do you think something works? How do you know that what your experience as working isn't caused by something else? The idea of correlation. Are you okay spending a ton of money on what you're doing on something that you aren't even fully sure is the cause or working properly? In other words, are you happy delivering something that does not what you promised, right? Shouldn't you be sure? If you're spending money on other people's money, you need to be positive you're right, or at least have supporting data, supporting evidence that you might be right. Right? We have that obligation, right? We have an obligation to the people we serve, not to sell snake oil, to make snake oil pervasive. And right now, I think too many in our field are embarrassing us.
And I think I thank you so much, because it really fits so well into what with Melanie we're talking about, the designer biases that we have, the misconceptions, myth or superstitions, and definitely don't miss out on Clark Quinn. We're going to be here, and I'm checking out on the book chapter that you mentioned to read more into Kolb's experiential learning. I think it's a tremendous conversation that we started here today, and I'll definitely follow up on the conversation on LinkedIn in the comments, and also ask you, Matthew, to share the link to these folder, or what you said, of studies showing problematic results in a field, right? Was it emotional intelligence, I think?
Yeah. So we don't make any money from this, but if you go to the LDA website, LDA Accelerator, and under stuff, there's a bookstore. And under the bookstore are books on this topic, as well as learning design, instruction, and things that pretty much most of these learning translators I've named have vetted in the past. And so I'm really supportive of this bookstore. And I know I created this store by collecting them, so I'm biased. So I get my biases there. But it's a collection of books on these very topics that are vetted by those researchers, or research translators. So it's a good source of content. We don't make money from any of this book sales. So
thanks a lot for sharing that. I'll definitely check that out as well. And with that, Matthew, it was tremendous having you here on Virtual Space Hero. Again, a pleasure to have talked to you. And you know that I prepared a small virtual cocktail backstage. I'm going to join you immediately, so don't drink everything.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Yay.
Here's the picture. It's reversed.
Very, very good. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for joining our conversation here about myths, misconceptions, and superstitions when it comes to learning. I think it is a very hard conversation, or it's a very deep conversation that you need to have, and it's a tough job to question what you're using in your training and learning designs. But I think it's a very important one. And next week, the next Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live on Monday. So we're changing again time. You know that we're playing around a little bit to see what time better suits your needs. And next time on Monday, we're talking with Scott Rouse, connecting from the US, about digital body language. So don't miss this one. I'm very much looking forward to talking to Scott. He's a phenomenal reader, understander, body language expert, having a very diverse background. So it will be for sure a very interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing you, and don't forget, become a hero of the virtual space. And also don't forget to check out on the conference, the JAGI conference about interactive techniques for improved learning. So 23 to 25th, 23rd to 25th of March. And with that, I'm leaving you here. Thanks a lot for joining. Thanks, Martina, for being with us. Thanks a lot for joining our conversation. And have a lovely weekend. See you on Monday, hopefully. Bye.